I was halfway through my usual black coffee when I noticed her sitting across the room, hunched over her cup as if it could absorb all the weight she carried. Madison. She had that same distracted look she always wore, the one that made it clear she was somewhere between here and somewhere else entirely. I didn't approach immediately. I never did. I preferred to let people find their own pace, their own space. But when she spoke, it pierced the quiet like a fragile glass breaking softly. Ese amor non correspondido me consome, she said, almost whispering, her voice barely lifting above the hum of the. Her hands trembled slightly, wrapping around the mug as though it were an anchor. I hesitated, caught off guard by the rawness in her tone. She rarely admitted vulnerability like that, even to herself, I imagine. I took a slow sip, letting the warmth of the coffee settle me, and then said, quietly, "But I have always loved you." Not in a dramatic declaration, not in a desperate attempt to change her mind, just a simple truth I had carried with me for longer than I could remember. Her eyes flicked up, startled, but there was no rush in my word, no demand for her to react immediately. I let the silence stretch between us, letting the moment. She laughed, a brittle, almost self-mocking sound. "You always say things like that?" she said, shaking her head, though her hands stopped trembling slightly. "But you don't know what it's like, to feel so empty when no one else notices." Her voice faltered. I could see the exhaustion in her posture, the small, internal battles she fought every day. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my tone calm, steady. "I notice," I said simply, "even when you don't want to be noticed." She looked at me, properly looked, as if she were measuring whether I was someone who could bear the weight she carried. The cafe noises faded into the background, leaving just us. She played with the spoon in her cup, stirring absent-mindedly. "It's strange," she murmured, "to realize someone sees you, even when you're trying to hide." Her voice was quieter now, more uncertain, like she was testing a fragile truth she wasn't sure she deserved. "I'm not asking for it," I said, leaning forward slightly, letting my presence be a kind of support rather than pressure. "I just want to be here, for as long as you need." Her lips parted, a faint, almost imperceptible smile forming. She didn't respond immediately, but she didn't leave either. For the first time that day, she seemed to breathe a little easier, and I realized, as I watched her fingers trace the rim of her cup, that sometimes being noticed quietly, steadily, without expectation, could be the first step towards something. I didn't know where this conversation would, only that it had begun. And in the quiet of that crowded cafe, something fragile and unspoken began to take shape between us. The next time I saw Madison, she was sitting in the same corner of the cafe, a little later than usual, her notebook open but mostly ignored. I ordered my usual, black and bitter, and took the seat across from her. She glanced up, hesitated, then offered a small, tentative smile. It wasn't a smile that demanded response. It was a quiet acknowledgement that the moment existed. She stirred her tea absently, eyes drifting over the steam as though she could follow her thoughts into it. "I keep thinking about what I said the other day," she admitted. Her voice carried the same fragile cadence, as if she were testing the air before letting it reach me. "I mean, that thing about unrequited love. I didn't mean to unload on you." "You didn't unload," I said. "You shared." I watched her pause, processing the difference between those two words. It mattered more than I expected. She leaned back, crossing her arms, trying to shield herself while still holding space for the conversation. I didn't push her to speak more. I never did. The weight she carried wasn't mine to lift. It was hers to unfold. We sat in silence for a few minutes. The quiet wasn't uncomfortable. On the contrary, it had a rhythm. Her pencil tapped softly against the paper, the faint scrape harmonizing with the distant chatter and clinking cups. I noticed the way her shoulders relaxed when she thought no one was watching. It was subtle, but I saw it. Small gestures like that mattered to me more than grand statements ever could. "You make it sound so easy," she said finally, her voice tinged with amusement and disbelief. "Just noticing someone, staying." Her eyes searched mine, as if she expected a lecture or a dramatic confession. I only smiled gently, leaning back, letting the silence answer her instead. "You make it sound easy because it doesn't need to be complicated. I'm not asking for. I just choose to be here. You don't have to respond. You don't have to explain. You just exist, and that's enough." She chuckled, a quiet, almost shy sound. "I guess I've been waiting for someone to say that. Not in a romantic, you have to love me way, but just in a way that makes being seen feel safe." I nodded, understanding the depth behind her words. Being safe wasn't about walls or shields. It was about presence and consistency. For the next hour, we spoke in fragments, half sentences and long pauses. We shared small stories about our days, about people we knew, things we noticed, without forcing a narrative. The conversation was organic, moving in curves and spirals, never demanding clarity, but giving space for truth to settle quietly. When she finally packed her things, There was a hesitation in her movement, a fleeting glance that suggested she wasn't quite ready to leave the safety we'd built. I said nothing, simply letting my calm presence hold the space. As she walked away, I realized that the thread between us had grown a little stronger, stitched with patience, observation, and the unspoken promise that someone was there, consistently, without needing anything in return. The next time I met Madison, the cafe was quieter than usual. Late afternoon sun slanting across the worn wooden tables. She looked different somehow, tense in a way that wasn't just about the world outside. I noticed the slight tightness in her jaw, the way her fingers drummed nervously against her notebook. "I've been thinking," she began, almost cautiously, "about why I feel like I always end up alone." Her eyes searched mine, but it wasn't accusation. It was something more fragile, a need to be understood. I nodded, letting her words settle before responding. I didn't rush to fill the silence. Sometimes, presence alone is the most comforting thing a person can offer. "My family, they mean well," she continued, voice dipping lower, almost hidden by the soft hum of the cafe. "But they keep reminding me that I need to settle down, make practical choices. And then there's the past, rejection, people I trusted who just left." Her hands wrapped around her cup as though she were bracing herself. I watched her, noting the weight in her posture, the vulnerability she didn't show to most people. "You've carried a lot," I said gently. "I can't take it away, but I can be here, if you want me to." My words were simple, without flourish, steady. I wanted her to feel that safety wasn't conditional, that she could lean without fear of being pushed away. She let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for years. "I don't know if I can trust it," she admitted, eyes dropping to the table. "Not easily. I've learned to rely on myself because trusting feels risky." I nodded again, understanding that the scars she carried weren't just emotional, they were practical lessons, walls built carefully. "You don't have to trust me right away," I said. "Just let me be someone consistent. That's all I ask. No pressure, no expectations, just being here when you need it." She looked up at me, eyes glimmering, a mixture of caution and curiosity. There was something unspoken between us, a fragile bridge starting to form. For the next hour, she spoke in fragments about her fears, the pressure to conform, the lingering disappointment of friendships lost, the quiet dread of solitude. I listened without interruption, only asking questions when I sensed she needed clarity for herself, never as a way to challenge or intrude. There was an odd intimacy in that exchange, a slow weaving of trust that didn't feel like a leap, but like a careful, deliberate step forward. When she finally stood to leave, I could tell she felt a little lighter, though still tethered to her anxieties. I simply smiled and said, "See you tomorrow." She nodded, a small, genuine and walked away. I remained seated, sipping my coffee, aware that small choices, spoken gently and consistently, were already beginning to alter the course of her days. It became a quiet ritual over the next few days. Madison arrived at the cafe around the same time, always choosing the same corner, always opening her notebook but seldom writing. I would settle into my chair, black coffee in hand, and wait, not impatiently, not expectantly, just present. The comfort of routine is subtle, but it has a weight all its own, and I could see it beginning to affect her. She arrived tense, a little guarded, but by the time she stirred her drink for the third time, there was a small easing of her shoulders. We didn't talk much at first, only enough to acknowledge each. "Morning," she would say, eyes down, and I would nod, a simple greeting that carried no hidden pressure. It was enough to start. The presence itself began to speak louder than any words. Slowly, our conversations lengthened, first a remark about the weather, then a comment about the book she was reading, then fragments of her thoughts, her worries, her small victory. One afternoon, she laughed softly at something trivial, and I realized how rarely she allowed herself that sound. It wasn't loud or brash, it was a hesitant, delicate laugh, as if she were testing the air before fully letting herself exist in it. I didn't comment, I just smiled, letting her have that moment without interruption, as though by acknowledging it too loudly, I might break it. "You always seem calm," she said once, almost in passing, and I studied her carefully. There was a hint of curiosity in her voice, a small attempt to understand what I was, without demanding explanation. "Even when things are messy, I don't rush to fix things that don't belong to me," I replied. "Sometimes the best way to help is just to be present." I watched her face soften, her eyes tracing the rim of her cup as if she were considering whether it was possible to trust that statement. Over the next hour, we talked in pauses and short sentences, our conversation weaving around interruptions, baristas calling orders, the distant rumble of the street outside. She shared minor frustrations, fleeting worries, and small triumphs, while I listened, only adding observations or questions when I sensed she needed to articulate a thought for herself. She began to lean into my presence without consciously acknowledging it, and I noticed the subtle shifts, longer glances, a relaxed posture, a willingness to speak aloud what she might otherwise have kept to herself. By the time she left, the afternoon had grown dim, sunlight fading to a soft. She hesitated at the door, looking back at me for a brief moment that seemed to hold the weight of acknowledgement. I didn't call out. I just gave a small nod, a silent assurance that I would be here tomorrow, and that she could continue to unfold at pace. In that quiet, routine presence, I realized something significant had begun to root itself between us, steady, patient, and unforced. It rained that evening, unexpected and insistent, sending streams of water down the city streets and splattering against the cafe. Madison and I found ourselves caught without umbrellas, and for a moment, we just stood under the awning, listening to the rain drum around us. Her notebook was soaked, her hair damp, but she didn't seem to mind, or maybe she did, but chose not to show it. "Looks like we're stuck," she said, a faint edge of humor in her. I offered a small shrug. "Or we can walk," I suggested simply, and she hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. Our steps splashed through puddles, the rhythm of our movement unspoken yet strangely coordinated. The air was thick with wet, earthy scent, and the city seemed to shrink around us, leaving just the two of us in a quiet cocoon. We didn't speak immediately. There was no need. The rain provided its own soundtrack, the occasional honk or distant shout fading beneath the percussion of drops on asphalt. I noticed her shoulders tensing and relaxing in waves, the subtle micro-movements that betrayed both anxiety and relief. There was a safety in the silence, a comfort in moving through it together. "You always seem so calm," she said finally, her voice almost lost in the rhythm of the rain. I glanced at her, seeing her face softened by droplets clinging to lashes, and even when everything around you is chaos. "I don't need to control everything," I said, slowing my pace to match hers. "Some things are better experienced quietly, some things better just shared in silence." Her gaze flicked to mine, a question unspoken, an invitation I didn't have to answer. I simply walked beside her, steady and unhurried. We passed under the pale glow of street lamps, our reflections blurred in puddles, our footsteps synchronized without effort. I noticed the tiny adjustments she made, holding her bag tighter, then loosening her grip, brushing wet strands from her face, a slight smile breaking free even as she tried to contain it. It was moments like this that revealed more than words ever could. By the time we reached the bus stop, soaked and tired, there was a calm between us that hadn't been there before. We didn't need to talk about the rain, or the wet clothes, or the sudden closeness that seemed to grow with every shared step. I didn't reach for her hand, didn't offer a joke or reassurance. I just stayed beside her, letting my presence be a quiet anchor. And when the bus arrived, she looked at me with a glance that said more than words ever could, an acknowledgement that this silent, shared journey mattered, that something fragile and essential had begun to grow between us. Madison hesitated at the door of her parents' house, a small apartment cluttered with years of memory, awards she had never cared for, and pictures that seemed to measure her by someone else's standards. I could see the tension coiling in her shoulders, the way she pressed her bag to her chest as if it could shield her from judgment. I simply walked beside her, steady, offering the presence she didn't need to justify or explain. "Do you really have to come in?" she asked quietly, glancing at me with a trace of worry. I nodded, calm. "If you want me here, I'm here. No performance required, no expectations." Her hand lingered near mine for a brief second, then fell. The weight of expectation she carried didn't need my reassurance. It needed the quiet certainty of someone who wouldn't flinch. Inside, her parents greeted her warmly, but their smiles carried an undertone of scrutiny. I noticed it immediately, the subtle glances that measured her choices, the questions wrapped in concern but loaded with implication. Madison stiffened, and I adjusted my posture, letting my calm absorb the tension without drawing attention to it. I didn't intervene, didn't explain her choices. I simply existed in the room, a steady presence, offering a silent anchor. Throughout the evening, I watched her relax in micro. She laughed softly at a joke, let a comment slide without over-explaining herself, and gradually leaned back in her chair. I didn't speak unless spoken to, and when I did, it was brief, thoughtful, without intrusion. Madison began to notice the difference between someone who rushed to fill spaces and someone who filled them quietly with constancy. Her mother commented on her work, her father asked about her routines, and each time, Madison responded with measured honesty. I didn't correct her, didn't offer assurances. I simply met her gaze when she looked for a quiet validation that she didn't need to perform to be seen. She began to exhale, even in small, nearly imperceptible sighs. The room's tension softened around her presence, and I could see the subtle relief in her eyes. By the end of the night, as we walked back through the quiet streets, Madison's hand brushed against mine, brief, hesitant, testing the space between us. I didn't move closer. I simply allowed the contact to exist, steady and unhurried. The apartment lights faded behind us, but the warmth she carried forward wasn't dependent on. In that simple walk, I realized that being chosen quietly, without dramatics or declarations, was transforming her fear into something lighter, something that allowed her to step into the evening with a sense of security she hadn't known she could trust. It was late when Madison appeared at my door, her coat damp and her expression taut with unspoken strain. She didn't knock in the usual way. She simply leaned against the frame, shoulders trembling just enough to betray the urgency she tried to hide. I gestured her inside without a word, closing the door gently behind her, and led her to the living room. The apartment was quiet, dimly lit, the kind of space that felt removed from the pressures waiting outside. She sank onto the sofa as if it were the only surface capable of holding her, curling slightly into herself. Her hands gripped the cushion edges, knuckles white, and for a long moment, she didn't speak. I sat on the floor beside the sofa, leaving her space but close enough that the subtle awareness of another presence could be felt without intrusion. There was no need to ask questions. Her anxiety spoke loudly enough in the tremor of her voice, in the catch of her breath, in the way she kept glancing toward the window. I can't handle it anymore," she murmured finally, voice small and raw. I didn't respond with advice or solution. I just nodded, letting her words land without judgment, letting them exist. The quiet between us became a steady rhythm, a safe harbor where she could unfold without fear of interruption. Hours passed in fragmented dialogue and long stretches of silence. She spoke in bursts, then stopped, then resumed, each pause weighted with reflection and hesitation. I never offered to fix her problems, never asked her to explain. I simply listened, occasionally offering a quiet acknowledgement, an "I hear you" without words, conveyed by posture and unwavering attention. Her presence was tentative, but with every small admission, she seemed to loosen the tension in her chest, allowing herself to exist without pretense. Eventually, she curled up on the sofa, as though sleep were the only escape, and I moved a blanket over, letting her rest. I didn't lie down beside her, didn't insist on conversation. I settled on the floor near the edge, close enough to be felt, distant enough to let her reclaim control of her space. The room remained still, filled with soft breathing and the muted hum of the city beyond the windows. Morning light filtered through the curtain, and I saw her stirring slowly, blinking against the brightness. The faint lines of worry softened. She didn't speak immediately. She didn't need to. I offered only a calm smile, an assurance that she was safe, that she had been heard. In those quiet hours, Madison began to understand the weight of presence, of being chosen simply because someone wanted to be there. No demands, no expectations, only steadiness. It started with the small gestures, almost imperceptible if you weren't paying attention. One evening, Madison mentioned she had misplaced the book she'd been reading, the one she carried everywhere, the one that seemed to anchor her thoughts. The next day, I brought it along, placing it on the table without a word. She noticed immediately, her eyes widening slightly, a mixture of surprise and quiet gratitude. I didn't comment. I simply let the presence of the book speak, letting her feel seen without ceremony. Another afternoon, she came by unannounced, shivering slightly from the cold. She didn't ask for anything, but I noticed her hesitation at the doorway. Without prompting, I offered her tea, warm and simple, the aroma filling the small apartment. She accepted, curling her hands around the cup, eyes softening as the warmth seeped into her. There was no rush, no expectation. She didn't have to speak if she didn't want to. The space itself, steady and unhurried, was the gift. We began to share more of these subtle exchanges, small acts that carried significance precisely because they were unspoken promises of attention, care, and constancy. I remembered her favorite soup recipe from a passing comment she made months ago, and one evening, I made it. She arrived, exhausted from her day, and the aroma met her before I did. Her shoulders relaxed, and she let out a faint, incredulous laugh. "You remembered," she whispered, almost to herself, as if it were impossible for someone to notice and care without expectation. I only nodded, the act itself enough. We also began spending quiet hours together, reading, working, or simply sitting. She had a habit of fidgeting with her pen when anxious, and I would leave her space to do so, letting her comfort come from her own patterns while maintaining the underlying assurance that I was present. She never had to ask for attention. She could simply exist, and it was enough for both of us. One evening, as the city lights flickered through the window, she paused and looked at me, a hint of vulnerability threading through her eyes. "It feels different," she said softly, "to be chosen like this." I met her gaze steadily, letting my expression carry the certainty she sought. "It's not about grand gestures," I said. "It's about showing up, every day, in ways that matter without needing to be noticed." Her lips curved into a small, genuine smile, one that seemed to take effort but reflected something deeper than amusement. I didn't push, didn't speak for. She leaned back, letting the moment settle, letting the quiet intimacy of shared simple choices fill the space between us. And in that silence, I understood that love could emerge quietly, persistently, in small, unremarkable ways, shaping connection through constancy rather than drama. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the city felt softer, its edges blurring under the glow of streetlights and the faint hum of distant traffic. Madison sat across from me at the kitchen table, a cup of tea cradled in her hands. I had been thinking about how much she had begun to rely on these small, shared routines, the quiet moments that mattered more than words ever could. There was no urgency, no dramatic confession, just a sense that something important was emerging between us. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice hesitant, almost testing the about us. I watched her carefully, noting the way her fingers traced the rim of her cup, a subtle nervous habit she couldn't quite hide. I didn't interrupt, didn't guide her words. I simply let her find the phrasing that felt right, the space to voice her thoughts without pressure. "I feel safer when I'm here," she admitted finally. "Not just physically, I mean emotionally. It's strange, but I can let my guard down without feeling guilty." Her gaze lifted, meeting mine with a quiet vulnerability that seemed both tentative and resolute. I nodded slowly, acknowledging the weight of her admission without comment, letting her understand that it was both seen and respected. "I want to be closer," she continued, her words careful, deliberate. "But I'm scared. I've never really allowed myself to let someone in like this." I leaned forward slightly, maintaining my calm presence, steady and unintrusive. "Then we take it slowly," I said, "at your pace. You decide what closeness looks like. I'll just be here, consistently, without asking anything in return." She exhaled, a long, quiet breath that seemed to release months, maybe years, of tension. After a pause, I asked simply, "Would you consider living here? Not as a requirement, not as a demand, but as a choice. To make a space together where everything is gradual but certain." Her eyes widened slightly, and I could see the internal debate, the years of caution, weighing against the desire for connection. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she let the silence stretch, letting the proposition sink in without haste. Finally, a faint, almost incredulous smile. I think I could," she whispered, the words more a decision than a question. I nodded, allowing the moment to exist without fanfare, without pressure. No declarations, no dramatics, just the quiet understanding that a choice had been made, that she had allowed herself to be chosen, and that the continuity of our presence could now grow without interruption. We sat together in that evening light, letting the reality of the decision settle between us. There were no promises loudly proclaimed, no grand gestures required. It was simply an acknowledgement that this shared space, built through patience, quiet care, and simple choices, had become something real, something that mattered deeply to both of us. The city outside continued its low hum, but inside, the rhythm of trust and gentle affection took precedence, shaping the early contours of a life quietly entwined. We found ourselves back in the cafe where it had all begun, the same corner where Madison's confession had first broken through the quiet of my routine. The light that slanted through the windows was gentler than it had been before, softer, as if the day itself knew something had shifted between us. She sat across from me, hands wrapped around her cup, and for a long moment we simply existed in the same space, neither rushing to speak, neither needing to. "I think this love, finally, has always been returned," she said quietly, her voice carrying a blend of wonder and disbelief. Her gaze met mine, tentative yet certain, and I nodded, letting the silence absorb the significance of her words. There was no grand declaration, no dramatics, only a steady acknowledgement that something essential had begun to settle between us. I reached across the table, lightly brushing my fingers against hers. The gesture was simple, deliberate, unhurried, a quiet confirmation that I had always been present, always constant, and that she was now choosing to trust that presence. She didn't pull away, but neither did she rush. She simply let it exist, allowing the moment to shape itself naturally. The conversation that followed was gentle, fragmented, the kind that doesn't seek conclusions but revels in the slow building of connection. We spoke of ordinary things, the weather, small frustrations, fleeting joys, yet every word carried weight, every pause a shared acknowledgement that we were no longer alone in our experiences. Madison's laughter, soft and unguarded, filled spaces that had long been tense or wary. The tension of past fears and familial pressures seemed to soften in the presence of quiet, steady affection. Later, we left the cafe together, walking without urgency through streets softened by evening light. Our hands found each other naturally, fingers intertwining without conscious effort. The world continued its low hum around us, indifferent yet familiar, while we moved in tandem, connected by unspoken promises of care and constancy. I felt her leaning slightly into my presence, her steps more relaxed, her eyes occasionally lifting to meet mine in a shared, wordless understanding. As we paused beneath a street lamp, the soft glow framing our figures, I realized that this love, the one she had feared unreturned, was never about urgency or possession or dramatic gestures. It had been about presence, about choosing to be there consistently, about letting someone exist fully and safely in the shared space we had built. Madison smiled, a quiet, knowing smile, and I returned it with the same steadiness, aware that this beginning, unforced and patient, had already changed everything.